It's like getting into a university. You get accepted and you walk in the door. That doesn't mean that you're going to graduate or that you're going to do well in any of the classes. Having that high VO2 max gets you in. That says you have the potential to be good at this sport, but it doesn't mean that you will be good. Slow twitch fibers typically have worse oxygen utilization than fast twitch fibers, but they have better vascular conductance. And what vascular conductance means is that slow twitch fibers have a greater capacity to increase blood flow. There's a third gas that's part of that respiratory cycle, and that gas is nitric oxide. And that nitric oxide is actually what controls the release of oxygen from our red blood cells into tissues. So whenever we're thinking about these people at the pinnacle, they may have found the special sauce that works perfectly for them. But we also need to consider that it's probably largely driven by genetics, environment as well. Me and you could both have the same downslope. It could be 5% per second. Yeah, we both have the same maximal rate of oxygen utilization. Well, if both of us bottom out at 10% oxygenation and you start at 80 and I start at 60, well, how much more substrate do you have to power that sprint than I do?
Okay, Evan, we're live on the podcast. Welcome back. It's 2022. It's been too long, my friend. How are you?
Yeah, definitely has. I'm doing well. How are you, man?
I'm doing very, very well. Again, really, really cool to have you back on. So for the 3 listeners that don't know you yet, I invite you guys to pause the podcast, go check out the 5 episodes we've recorded in the past with Evan. But can you still give us a brief intro to who you are and what you do before we jump into all the fun topics that I want to chat with you about today?
Yeah, absolutely. It was actually kind of funny. I told my wife I was going to be on the podcast today, and she's like, "Haven't you been on that one a few times already?" And I'm like, "God, I don't even know how many times it's been. It's a lot of them, though."
I think it's 5 or 6.
Yeah, somewhere on there. We've done a few with Pat and Andrew and Guglielmo as well. But yeah, I'm a physiologist these days. Also doing a lot of computational biology and data science as well. So kind of wearing a few different hats. In the past, I've worked with a lot of CrossFit athletes, military special operations, pro sport teams, primarily doing applied physiology consulting, more hands-on work with athletes. These days, I work for a Seattle-based biotech company. We do wearable development and analytics. So most of my days are research-based now, typically just digging into the weeds and experimenting.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome, man. So I want to go into a topic that's near and dear to my heart right now, which is physiological testing. I've been, thanks to you, actually, I have to thank you for that, because without your initial bioenergetics course on the classroom, I think it was almost 2 years ago now, I wouldn't have gone down that path. But I remember I messed up my back. I signed up for the classroom. I laid on the couch for like 2 weeks because I couldn't move. And I just took all the courses that were on there, and yours on yours was, I took it twice. Bioenergetics, I took it as well. And that's kind of when I flipped my understanding of the underlying physiology of let's say exercise in general. And that kind of, I haven't gotten out of that rabbit hole yet, as you know, and we chatted now for it was half an hour before we started recording. So if we try and marry, what you were doing before, what you're still doing now to some extent, and if we talk about physiological testing for CrossFitters, so there's obviously it's not the same as an endurance sport. An endurance athlete's maybe going to be interested in their VO2 max, on their first lactate or ventilatory threshold, on maybe their critical power, so they can distribute intensities properly. So if we talk about conditioning in CrossFit specifically, somebody wants to get better at rowing or at running or at biking. From your perspective for a CrossFitter, what metrics should they be looking at if they were to go and complete a physiological profile?
Yeah, so this is a really hard question in the context of CrossFit, because none of these traditional measurements, I'm going to say all of them are important. Your lactate threshold, your ventilatory threshold, your VO2 max, they're all important for CrossFit performance. I'm not going to dispute that. But one of the issues is how we actually collect these measurements. It makes it very inapplicable for the sport, because as you know, if you do a VO2 max test on a bike versus a Concept 2 rower versus a skier, you're going to get different values in every test. That's just 3 modalities. How many different modalities is a CrossFit athlete tested? It's dozens at this point. So even if they're doing a VO2 max test and you're able to structure it using sports movements, we don't necessarily know how that's going to translate back to CrossFit performance. And one of the huge considerations, you know this, I know this, is that when people are doing VO2 max testing and you actually look at what some of their underlying limiters are, they're different from person to person and modality to modality. So we also have to raise the question, if you do a VO2 max test on the assault bike and an athlete tests in that's 76 milliliters per kilogram per minute, and we're like, yeah, they have a VO2 max of an elite Olympic rower. One, they probably don't have rowing times anywhere near that, which gets into trying to understand how muscle mass influences VO2. But also, that doesn't mean that it's going to translate to them being good at thrusters or burpees or any of these other movements where they may not have the same respiratory frequencies or tidal volumes or any of these other factors. So the way that I think about VO2 max for CrossFit is that if you don't have a high VO2 max relative to your size, you're not going to be very good at CrossFit. But just because you do have a very high VO2 max for an athlete of your size and caliber does not mean that you're going to be a good CrossFit athlete. Because a high VO2 max, it's just like a barrier to entry. It's like getting into a university. You get accepted and you walk in the door. That doesn't mean that you're going to graduate or that you're going to do well in any of the classes. Having that high VO2 max gets you in, that says you have the potential to be good at this sport, but it doesn't mean that you will be good. I had a very high VO2 max when I started doing CrossFit. I was not a very good CrossFitter. You could go back and look at my open scores from 2015 and validate that if you want to. It's going to be horribly embarrassing. And the reason for that is that I was relatively weak. So sure, my VO2 max was close to 80 milliliters per kilogram per minute. I had like a 225 pound or 100 kilogram squat clean. It's not getting you very far in the open. For athletes that are very strong, they may have an incredibly high cost of oxygen consumption per muscle contraction. They're terribly inefficient. So this is just kind of digging into why VO2 isn't that useful, but you can make the same argument for any of these other types of tests. So I look at them for CrossFitters, but I'm not married to them, and it only influences how we actually train them to a very marginal degree.
So let's take a specific case where someone would have maybe a deficit on a given, let's take an erg or even like running, for example. So say somebody's good all around or doing okay, and they keep improving, but they're just bad on, say, the rower, for example. So in that case, what metrics would you get them to look at in order to maybe plan some specific training so that they could improve that one modality that they're having an issue with?
Yeah, so let's stick with VO2. Let's actually have them do a VO2 max test on the rower. And let's say they test in with a moderately high VO2 on the rower. So let's say 60 to 65 milliliters per kilogram. And this is a pretty high level CrossFitter, so nothing crazy there. Okay, so now we have that measurement. If they improve it, that's probably going to be a good thing, but I'm more concerned with why it isn't higher in the first place. Is it a bioenergetic limitation? For a CrossFit athlete, it's probably unlikely that they're impaired by their ability to utilize oxygen in the tissue or their maximal rate of oxygen utilization. It's just not likely with the kind of training they do. So it's probably an oxygen supply limitation. If it is a bioenergetic issue, so are they limited by their pulmonary system, their cardiovascular system, etc. Sometimes that is the case. But again, if it's a high-level CrossFitter, they're probably not limited there by a very high degree. So we typically want to look into, are they able to breathe on the rower? A lot of times athletes have crazy breathing mechanics when they're on the rower. Part of that is because it's just really hard to couple your breathing rate to your stroke rate, particularly if you're rowing at a very high intensity where you might be at 35 strokes per minute. Breathing 35 times per minute, while not difficult for a high-level endurance athlete, is near impossible for a lot of CrossFit athletes. So do we need to actually teach this person to breathe at a fast enough rate to couple stroke rate with respiratory rate? That makes a huge impact on a lot of CrossFitters' performance on the rower. But then once you accomplish that, are they actually breathing with sufficient volumes when they're breathing 35 times per minute? Or are they just breathing dead space air? So that's the second thing that you want to address. And all of this is assuming that they have good thoracic and pelvic positions that they can breathe well in the first place. A lot of times with CrossFitters, because they don't spend a ton of time on any given modality either, a lot of it could be an efficiency issue. So when you watch a very good rower or a very good runner, you could clearly see that their movement is fluid. They don't have jerking motions. They quickly transition from the concentric to eccentric based on different parts of their movement. A lot of CrossFitters don't look like that when they're rowing or they're running. So a lot of times it could be basic volume accumulation. I'm not really a fan of teaching people mechanics on these movements per se, unless they are just doing some crazy stuff. I think having volume, particularly at moderate to high intensities, allows people to fall into effective movement patterns for themselves. So I don't always think that you could look at someone and say, hey, their running form is perfect. Perfect running form is very individual specific. And someone may have what looks like kind of gnarly looking form, but it may actually be the most efficient motion for them. And you need to let people settle into that. So I know this kind of going in a lot of different tangents, but it's basically saying that you could start to whittle down and identify what these main limiting factors are for someone. It may be energetic, it may be movement related, it may be respiratory coordination. And then if you could focus on that and their performance is improving, that's great. Sometimes that performance improvement corresponds with an improvement in VO2. Sometimes they have a performance improvement, but no improvement in VO2. And that's where looking at these physiologic measurements isn't always useful, because you may improve in them without improving performance. And you may improve in performance and have some of these markers like VO2 decrease. What do you do with that information?
No, that's a great question. You raise here a few things I want to come back on that you mentioned. The breathing on the rower is, like you said, some people know how to couple their breathing to their stroke. Some people don't know how to do so. And so when you see someone at 100 watts on the rower at a very low intensity and they're breathing 33 times a minute because they're doubling their breath on every stroke, when they could really just breathe deeper and breathe slower. And usually even just mentioning that to them, they realize, oh yeah, I've always not understood how to breathe on the rower. And that makes total sense now to just breathe deeper and breathe less per minute. And I found it to be an interesting strategy to develop even on the low intensity work to just try and maximize volume up to a point, obviously, because you know that if you push every breath to its utmost depth, you're actually just probably not being as efficient as you could be, but just a lot of volume, as little frequency as possible helps with CO2 retention as well, right? Which is going to have some positive effects on what's going on. On the mechanics, I agree with you where, especially for running, from what I've been looking into on the endurance side recently, if you look at most high-level runners or very high-performance runners, let's say on the longer distances, they don't run like you would see in a textbook, but they've just done it so much. They've just put that foot on the ground so many times that now they're just efficient in that pattern that they're running in, even if it's maybe not the theoretically the most efficient. So would you then say that, well, usually CrossFitters, and we've talked about this in a past podcast already, they tend to train a lot, probably arguably in general too much, or too much at higher intensity. So would one approach to this be maybe lowering the intensity a little bit at least on the monostructural stuff, so they could accumulate more volume without generating too much fatigue, and thus maybe gain a little bit of efficiency, a little bit more practice on those movements, and just time under that moderate load, which we know is extremely important for recovery, for performance, etc.
Yeah, I think if they're in intermediate to early stage advanced, I think that could be a really good strategy. The hard thing is when you're dealing with the top CrossFit athletes who are effectively competing year round. Sometimes you don't always have the ability to pull back the reins on intensity and leverage these kinds of approaches. And this is where CrossFit is kind of unique in terms of how you actually tackle. Sometimes you have the best options, and I think what you're saying is probably one of the best options for most people. Sometimes that's a non-option for the elite athlete, and that just gets into like a whole nother rabbit hole of what makes sense is largely context dependent. But in general, I think that is a good approach.
Can you explain or talk about the reason for the differences in VO2 in rowing and, for example, in cycling, and the role of muscle mass and the role of time to apply force, to generate force? And when we see obviously a you're on the bike, you're turning 80, 90 times a minute. So your legs have that many opportunities to produce force. And on a rower, we're down to 20, maybe 30. So talk about those differences and the impact on the physiology of the athlete.
Yes, so in general, we could say that as total muscle mass engaged in the activity increases, total oxygen consumption is also going to increase. That's only true up to a point. So if we, in a theoretical world, say you're using 0% of your total muscle mass, obviously not possible, all the way up to between 40 and 60% of your total muscle mass, and we've plotted those as a function of one another, you'd see they're near linearly correlated. So as you go from using 0% of your total muscle mass all the way up to 40 to 60%, depending on the person, oxygen consumption is going to increase. Once you reach that threshold, though, engaging additional muscle mass does not increase VO2 further. So if you're cycling, for example, you're not engaging a ton of muscle mass. So if you were to switch to a running posture, for example, running uses more total muscle mass than cycling. VO2 is probably going to go up. Then you switch from cycling or running to rowing, VO2 will probably go up. But now let's switch from rowing to cross-country skiing. The increase is probably going to be quite marginal, if anything, assuming you're actually well developed in both of those. And then you go, I don't even know, it would be more muscle than cross-country skiing. Let's just say you're spastically thrashing at a very high intensity, probably not going to do a lot. And that comes down to the intricacies of systemic cardiovascular control. So the way that we could think about this is that our heart, right now, me and you are sitting here at rest, we're not doing any activity. Our heart's almost working to its maximal limit right now. So we can't increase our cardiac output that much more than the amount of work that it's doing while we're just sitting here talking. I'm drinking a little bit of coffee, so that's probably not helping me either. So when we start exercising, we're increasing more muscle mass, and yes, cardiac output is ramping up to get more blood flow to the periphery to supply our muscles with oxygenated blood. But there's a very finite limit to how much we can do that. So one of the ways that we actually improve our ability to get oxygenated blood to the periphery, yes, it's improving our cardiac output. Part of it is dilating our blood vessels, opening them up so blood could flow more freely. We could only do that to a certain degree, though. So if we were to dilate all of our blood vessels in our arms and our legs right now, we would need so much more blood than we actually have to maintain our blood pressure. So if you were to inject what's called sympathomimetic drug in your arms and your legs right now, and you just dilated all your blood vessels, you just face plant on your desk, and you would have you'd essentially have autonomic nervous system failure. You would lose consciousness, you wouldn't get enough oxygen to your brain, and you would die rather quickly. So your brain's never going to let that happen. So once you get past that 40 to 60-ish% of total muscle mass engaged, your brain's not going to let you dilate any more blood vessels. And as a consequence of that, you're not going to be consuming oxygen in these other tissues because your brain's not letting you get blood there to use oxygen. So this is why we have this kind of skewed relationship where on a very simple level, we could say more muscle is a higher VO2, but it's only true up until a point. And past that point is where we start to think about systemic control. And this is like a long-winded way of getting to why I don't actually think cardiac output is a exercise. Like you look in the literature and it says cardiac output, stroke volume, they're the principal determinants of VO2. I really don't think that's the case. And I think cardiac output is actually a very overhyped variable. I think it's a second tier measurement for performance. And there's other things that are much more important than cardiac output.
I want to come back to that point that you just made, the cardiac output limiting factor or not, and why. Two things that came to mind while you were talking. When you were talking about the vasodilation that we're able to improve through training and its effect on how much blood we can deliver to the periphery, to the working muscles, is there a relationship between that vasodilator capacity, let's call it, or an increase in your ability to vasodilate and the increase in blood volume that we see through training? Because it would make sense that if you make bigger pipes, you would need more fluid to fill the pipes. Is there any any causal link between those two? Does your blood volume increase because you're making more room in your vasculature?
Yeah, so to a degree, so assuming cardiac output is sufficient, if you train in a way that improves your capillary density, so there's more capillaries surrounding a muscle fiber, yeah, you're going to have higher blood volumes and larger blood flow there. Because the way that you can think about capillaries is right now at rest, not all of our capillaries in our muscle are open. So let's say we have 100 capillaries surrounding the muscle fibers in our quads. I'm completely making up numbers here. Roughly 20% of them are going to be open, and the other 80 of them will be closed. As we start exercising, more of those capillaries are going to open to allow more blood flow into the tissue. So over time, if we improve the number of capillaries we have a higher potential to increase blood volume and flow through that tissue. And that's also going to improve our ability to utilize oxygen, because more capillary density around a muscle fiber means shorter distances for oxygen to diffuse from the blood into the muscle tissue, and more total oxygen could be used. And this actually gets into why it's actually the primary reason why slow twitch fibers, we think of them as less fatiguing than fast twitch fibers. Slow twitch fibers typically have worse oxygen utilization than fast twitch fibers, but they have better vascular conductance. And what vascular conductance means is that slow twitch fibers have a greater capacity to increase blood flow. So this is why they allow you to sustain work for longer. Greater capacity to increase blood flow means better blood flow. They're getting a better supply of oxygenated blood. So this is why training in a way that could particularly improve capillarization around the fast twitch fibers, you're improving vascular conductance in those fast twitch fibers. That means that you could maintain very high oxygen utilization rates. This is when we start thinking about power endurance. That's capillarization of fast twitch fibers.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I was actually, my second point was going to be capillarization for CrossFit is what I wrote as a little note here when you were talking before. Mm-hmm. So it would make sense, like because from what I've seen in the research, I think it was Annie Van Hadelo presenting on, it was a presentation on YouTube that I saw, and showing that with increased capillarization, the blood volume necessary for a given work rate actually goes down, because you have a better, I guess, transfer, you have a better extraction, you have a more surface for the oxygen to pass from the blood into the muscle. So that would make sense that you would want to maximize capillarization of both type 1 and type 2 A and X fibers for CrossFit. In that vein, do you see any merit to protocols or methods or just training with light weights, with maybe lower velocity, and trying to make, I'm thinking of kind of a cardiac output circuit, but it's not, the goal is not necessarily cardiac output per se, but the capillarization. So does something like this have a place in CrossFit training, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think so, with the caveat that yes, improving capillarization, improving vasodilator capacity, those are great for CrossFit, because CrossFit is quite literally the sport of cardiovascular control. But if this is where cardiac output comes in, if you have shitty cardiac output, your brain's not going to let you dilate. So you could have amazing capillary density. You could have the best capillary density in the world, amazing vasodilator capacity. But if your cardiac output is low, your brain's never going to let you dilate. So it doesn't really matter that you have these capacities. And this is why I said I think of cardiac output as like a second tier limiter. Vasodilator capacity is number one, but then you need your cardiac output to be high enough to back that up, so you could actually dilate under pressure when you need it.
So let's jump right into it. Let's talk about cardiac output as the supporting, let's say the supporting quality to a great capillary and vascular network, right? So you want the most amount of surface for your oxygen to go from the blood into the muscle, because it's just more efficient, just makes more sense at every level. But then, like you said, you need the machinery to push the blood to those different places. So to what extent can we change cardiac output, and through what mechanisms from your research and experience?
Yeah, so you could change cardiac output I want to say to a very high degree, but that's not really true because cardiac output, I mean, at most, it's going to increase about sevenfold, which sounds like a lot, but that's really not a lot. So I want to like pull the ultimate Pat Davidson, just throw a boomerang out there and come back to this in like 5 minutes and kind of answer this in a completely backwards way. Is that cool with you?
I would love that.
Okay. So this is going to seem like the oddest digression, but I think talking about a intestinal parasite is going to be a very good way to come back to cardiac output and explain what role cardiac output does actually have. And the reason that I want to talk about intestinal parasites is I think we need to talk about nitric oxide and its role in the respiratory cycle to then understand the importance of cardiac output and where it does fall short for delivering blood. So this is a story that was told to me by one of my mentors. He was one of the ones originally involved in this research. And if you want to see something disgusting, Google the intestinal parasite Ascaris. It's horrifying. If you've ever seen Stranger Things, it looks like the Demogorgon that opens its face up and swallows people. And it's actually a really common intestinal parasite in a lot of developing countries. One of the things that's really fascinating about this parasite is it has humongous hemoglobin molecules attached to it, but it lives in the intestine, which is an anaerobic environment. So you're like, okay, what is this worm doing with hemoglobin if it lives in a place that there's no oxygen? Conceivably makes no sense whatsoever. And the short answer is that this worm actually uses hemoglobin and a gas called nitric oxide to seek out and destroy oxygen. So it's essentially an oxygen eating function of hemoglobin. And that dates all the way back to roughly 2 billion years ago is when that specific function of hemoglobin evolved. So if we project all the way back to then, what basic story is that hemoglobin first evolved to destroy nitric oxide because nitric oxide killed early microbial life. It was poisonous to them. So a lot of these early microbes, they evolved the mechanism to break down nitric oxide into nitrate, which is a food for bacteria. And as a short digression, this is why you're not supposed to rinse your mouth with mouthwash before having beetroot juice, because we want the nitrates from beetroot. That's what gives it the vasodilator function, the performance benefit. You use Listerine, you kill those oral bacteria, and now you can't break down the oxides into nitrates and you don't get the benefit. But then anyway, so after they evolved this function, 500 million years later, there were more algae in Earth. And what do plants and algae do? They breathe out oxygen. Oxygen was slowly building up in the atmosphere. That's why we're alive today. But a lot of microbes hated that because oxygen was poisonous to them. So specifically, there were a lot of primitive worms and nematodes, and they were poisoned by oxygen, and they wanted to figure out a way to get rid of it. I'm saying they wanted to. This is evolution. There's no intended goal of it. And the way that they did this is by capturing nitric oxide first, so that gas that we talked about before, and then using nitric oxide to destroy oxygen. And this mechanism actually paved the way for further evolution, and it actually explains how hemoglobin in our bodies use nitric oxide to shuttle oxygen around. So we have hemoglobin, and it's packed with red blood cells, and these red blood cells, or hemoglobin in the red blood cells, evolved a way to change shape so they could carry oxygen and CO2 through our circulatory systems. This is the respiratory cycle that we're all familiar with, but that nitric oxide didn't go away. So this is where we have to realize that our current understanding of respiration, that every single one of us were taught in school growing up, we breathe in oxygen, the oxygen goes to the tissues, and the hemoglobin picks up carbon dioxide, and then it gets shuttled out and expelled. That's not wrong, but it's actually incomplete. There's a third gas that's part of that respiratory cycle, and that gas is nitric oxide. And that nitric oxide is actually what controls the release of oxygen from our red blood cells into tissues. So nitric oxide is one of the most important signaling molecules in our body, and it plays a fundamental role in how we dilate our blood vessels. So when nitric oxide is activated, it forms these complexes with our very specific cysteine molecule in our hemoglobin. And that is when our hemoglobin is in its oxygenated state. So hemoglobin is kind of like a Rubik's Cube. If it's oxygenated or deoxygenated, it kind of changes shapes and configurations. If our red blood cells are unable to carry nitric oxide, that means that oxygen can't get to our tissue and vasodilation is impaired. So raises a really important question. Why is cardiac output important for oxygen delivery? So this isn't a trick question. Like, what is cardiac output good for? It gets oxygenated blood to our working muscle. So cardiac output is obviously very important for getting oxygen to the tissues and maintaining blood pressure. But when we think about how blood pressure is determined, it is cardiac output multiplied by what's called total peripheral vascular resistance. So this is essentially the friction in the different pipes in our bodies and blood vessels. Total peripheral vascular resistance is strongly impacted by blood vessel radius. And specifically, it is inversely proportional to radius raised to the fourth power. So what this basically means is cardiac output, we already said it could only increase maybe 4 to 7-fold. Radius to the fourth power means that we could impact blood flow by hundreds of orders of magnitude. So what's more important, cardiac output, vessel radius? It's absolutely vessel radius. This is going to have the biggest change because a tiny difference in blood vessel radius has a massive impact on blood flow. Mm-hmm. So the importance of cardiac output is not that our heart needs to be so strong. The person with the strongest heart in the world is not going to be able to pump that much more blood than you or I. The person that dilates their blood vessels a little bit more than we do is going to have a huge exponential increase in blood flow. So cardiac output is only important so far as it allows us to dilate those blood vessels. So this nitric oxide molecule is number one. If you are lacking nitric oxide, you are lacking capillarization, you have no way of nourishing your tissues with oxygen or dilating your blood vessels. So if that's missing, it doesn't matter what your cardiac output looks like. It could be the cardiac output of Eliud Kipchoge, doesn't matter. You're not going to do good in endurance sports. But once you get that fundamental dilation component, now the higher you could get your cardiac output, the better your performance, because you're going to be supporting your ability to maintain prolonged blood vessel dilation. And now you're going to be the person that could hold maximal cardiac outputs forever. So this is my very long-winded way of basically saying why cardiac output is important, but it's also not that important if other fundamental building blocks are missing.
I love that you went all the way to a gut parasite to come back to this. This was a great journey, and I think Pat would be proud if he heard that bit, because he's definitely the expert when it comes to going so far you can't even see him anymore, and then coming back and hitting you right where you were right to answer your question. So that was really good. So that brings me to thinking about, you know, and I'm very, keep in mind, I'm very focused, and maybe my framework and my bias right now is very much endurance sports. That's the literature that I'm reading. It's what I'm investigating, trying to improve my understanding of. So in that context, when we're talking about, you know, let's say training in the moderate intensity domain, so under your first lactate or ventilatory threshold. So you'll see cyclists doing, you know, hours, dozens of hours per week of this kind of work. And usually one of the benefits that is taunted is the cardiac output. But would it then be more appropriate to say, or should we put an emphasis on the impact of this kind of work on vasodilated capacity, on capillarization? Because my understanding is that to improve those qualities, you need flow. You need flow, and you need flow for long periods of time, because that's, think of if you think of a river, or you think of a water stream, if you just kind of throw a bucket of water on a slight slope, the water is going to go, and then it's just going to go into the ground, and now it's gone. But if you have a fire hydrant, let's say, that's broken and that's just spitting water out, now what you're going to see is starting to see all those kind of tiny rivers build, and they're going to build in magnitude, and down the line it's just going to keep on going and going. And that's how I kind of picture capillarization happening. Would you say that this is how it goes, and that this is what or one of the things we should be thinking about when we're talking about low intensity endurance work?
Yeah, so I think that's a good way of thinking about it, but I do start to question how much those multiple hours of long steady state are really increasing capillarization, because one of the things that we know is if we want to increase capillarization, we want to increase more of a molecule called VEGF. That's vascular endothelial growth factor. So we know that technically we want shear stress on our vasculature to increase this molecule. If you go all out for 20 seconds on a bike, there's going to be a ton of shear stress on your vasculature. And you would think that you would get a ton of this vascular endothelial growth factor, and you do, but you also get what are called anti-angiogenic factors. So you actually don't really get that much capillarization. You see that VEGF shoot up, but you also see an antagonist to VEGF shoot up even higher. So you don't get that benefit. On the flip side, if we go super long, steady state exercise, we don't really get that large increases in VEGF because there's not a lot of blood flowing through those pipes and pushing. At some point when you're doing very endurance training, you're essentially at a metabolic steady state and blood flow is not increasing in those blood vessels anymore. You get an initial spike up and then you just kind of stay flatlines. There's clearly some Goldilocks zone between short, very, very high intensity and long, very low intensities where VEGF is going to be maximized. Of course, when you look in the literature, it's so context specific. You see some papers and are like, oh, you could do Nordic walking with ski trekking poles, and this is going to increase VEGF. And you're like, yeah, that's in 78-year-olds with heart failure. When you look in the sports science literature, it's very muddy because a 60-minute bike at a moderate intensity may increase VEGF for someone who's unaccustomed to doing that style of training. Someone who's an ultra marathoner, they're not increasing VEGF with 60-minute, 2-hour, 3-hour steady states because they're so efficient and metabolically adapted to that. They're really not creating a lot of fear stress on the vasculature. So it looks like the sweet spot is probably what we would consider like tempo work, something in that like 20 to 40-minute time range, depending on the individual, and potentially doing multiple sets of that. So you're having these progressive increases in intensity where you're actually forcing progressively greater blood flow into a tissue and you're creating that vascular stress, but you're also compounding that over time. And for a marathon runner, that may mean doing 3 or 4 30-minute intervals, which sounds like a lot, but that's normal. I've worked with cross-country skiers in the past, and I used to write workouts that I would just look at and just feel bad for people. I'd say, like, you're going to do 6 25-minute intervals at X pace today. In my head, I'm just like, man, this looks horrible. I don't want to do this. But that's parlance for those types of sports. Where a CrossFitter, you may be able to get away with 2 to 3 15 to 20-minute intervals at a much more reasonable pace, and that might be something that's going to increase capillarization. We also need to consider that there is some sweet spot to lower intensity intervals, like the classic 4x4 VO2 intervals. They are going to increase capillarization as well. But again, we do want a lot of time for this to accumulate, and you're not going to be smashing those very frequently or for very long durations. So it's a little bit of everything.
Yeah, that reminds me, and I was able to pull it up while you were finishing that point. Reminds me of, I don't know if you had a look at Niels van der Poel's training manual that he released. So
was this, is this the guy, he's a
speed skater?
Speed skater, yes.
Yeah,
I've heard of this, but I haven't looked into it yet.
I read it, I made some notes, and I made a little video. It's in French on my YouTube channel. But it's fascinating. Essentially, in his base season, he was working up to 35 hours a week of cycling between 220 and 260 watts, and he would do that outdoors. Like, you would just go for a 6-7 hour ride 5 days a week.
Yeah.
And then in his second season, he calls it threshold, and he's essentially doing pretty much 2 hours of work per session around 400 watts. And so that reminded me of that sustained work. So it's probably not, his critical power is probably a bunch higher than that, but because, I mean, you can't do 4 times 30 minutes at critical power on 5-minute rest. But if it is a little bit lower, if it is more in that tempo area, you would definitely, I mean, you would, with the workloads that he's able to tolerate, he would be able to do that. He would do those kind of workouts 5 days a week after that base building phase of 35 hours of cycling per week. So it would make sense that you would need, like you said, maybe more. So for a lower, would it be fair to say that for a lower level athlete, maybe that low intensity zone 2 type work might be sufficient to some extent, but then when you reach, you're going to reach a plateau there, and you're going to have to increase essentially the shear stress applied on your vasculature, which does mean going to slightly higher outputs, because I guess the zone 2 that a cyclist would do, you're going to be primarily building those type 1 fibers and also the fatigue resistance qualities of those fibers, but like from what you're saying, not necessarily the vascular network directly, right?
Yeah, exactly. So one of the things we want to consider is deoxygenation is going to be good in general for nitric oxide release and for increase in VEGF. So if you're holding an interval for 2 hours and there's no net deoxygenation during that period, it's probably not going to be driving that adaptation. But if we could have some mild progressive desaturation over that period, that's probably going to be favorable for us. So I think if you were to like take what he's doing and scale that to a normal person, it's probably going to be in that ballpark of what we would want. But by the way, as you were saying his training, I'm just thinking 7 hours at 260 watts. Like, God, I feel so out of shape just hearing that. That's just an incredible workload. And this is also where I don't always like to extrapolate too much from these kinds of people's training. Because for example, I mean, the dude crushed it at the Olympics. He's clearly very impressive, but on the flip side, you could think of like one of the greatest bodybuilders of all time, Dorian Yates. He recommended doing 2 sets per muscle group per week to complete failure. That's not going to do anything for anyone, and Dorian Yates literally looks like a rhino on anabolic steroids. So whenever we're thinking about these people at the pinnacle, they may have found the special sauce that works perfectly for them. But we also need to consider that it's probably largely driven by genetics, environment as well. So I always try and be careful, because if you had 10 people at a world-class level training the exact same manner as this guy, it's probably onto something. There's probably some principles that we could distill, the idea that success needs clues. But when you have one person that's beating everyone in the world and their training looks much different than everyone else, it's getting second, third, fourth, they've probably stumbled upon something that is very N of 1 specific, and it may not translate to other individuals. So using that Dorian Yates example, you're like, okay, who got third, fourth, fifth, sixth at the Olympia against him? Second through sixth training is probably more in line with what the average person would need to drive those adaptations than what Dorian Yates is doing. So it's just something that I think is worth considering for context, because I see people think the same thing in CrossFit. They're like, oh, what's Noah doing? That's probably what I need. And it's like, no, what Noah's doing is very specific to Noah. You're probably going to destroy all of your tendons if you do that.
I fully agree with you. I think context is massively important. Another thing that he did like nobody else was train 5 days on, 2 days off. So 2 days off in a row. It was the weekend, so he could just disconnect from training and go spend time with his friends and have a social life. And that was really important to him, but also obviously really hard. So, and there's, I recommend that anybody who's interested in, high level performance, go read his training manual, because it's a very insightful PDF, and I just can't do anything else but recommend it. So we need, and I guess going back to the train of thought of the tempo work, what comes to mind then is that when you get to a certain level, you need high volumes of this kind of work to keep developing your vascular network, your capillarization. But that type of training comes at a higher cost energetically and from a nervous standpoint as well than the lower intensity work, say below your first threshold. So that's where intensity and intensity distribution management comes into play, and knowing how much of what work to do and not do too much of the stuff that's going to fatigue you. Otherwise, you might go too far into it and not be able to recover and come back from it, right?
Yeah, and I think this is where we're looking at what elite athletes do, because one of the really interesting things is that when you look at elite endurance athletes, a lot of them do train in a very polarized way, but you look at other training and you're like, it truly is not polarized. They're just doing insane amounts of volume at moderate to high intensities and actually very little low intensity work in some cases. But the reason for that is that those volumes aren't insane to them. It's something that they could clearly tolerate. So it's also worth considering how important is low intensity aerobic work once you get to a certain level. It may be that there's only so many adaptations you could get from that. And then at that point, most training is hard. There is some easy recovery work, and it just needs to be such that that hard training is dialed into that individual's capacities. Like you look at how a lot of the top Ethiopian distance runners train, and most of it is hard training. Just insane volumes of hard training with some light training sprinkled in. You look at a lot of the top Kenyan distance runners training as well, Eliud Kipchoge's training. Pretty much all of it is hard. He's not going out and slogging low, easy miles, but the volume is very much dialed into what he could tolerate week after week. So it's similar to when you look at a strength athlete's training. None of their training is easy, but they're just training within their tolerable volume range. Or a bodybuilder, every work set is hard. It's enough to be developmental, and they're just titrating their work sets so they can tolerate the workload. And I think it's actually very similar for these top level endurance athletes in some cases, where every run is hard, every interval is hard, and they're just controlling their total workload week to week and titrating it up and down so they're not burning themselves out.
That makes a lot of sense. Going back to nitric oxide, I've read in a bunch of books that if you breathe through your nose, you release more nitric oxide. And I haven't been able to find anything that might validate that in terms of a measurement. First of all, I wouldn't even know how to measure nitric oxide. Is there any, I mean, I know you've made videos with TTT about nose breathing, and I definitely see the benefits, especially in a low intensity context, up to a point. But then specifically about nitric oxide, is there anything going on with nose breathing and nitric oxide from your perspective?
So that is true, but it's completely irrelevant because that is a different form of nitric oxide. That is nitric oxide that is produced in the airways, has no relation whatsoever to the form of nitric oxide that's regulating blood flow in the peripheries, or the type that's controlling autoregulation of blood flow in the brain, the heart, the muscles. So when people say that, they're very much just misinterpreting the science because they don't actually understand free radical biology.
Okay, so maybe spell it out for us, because I think that's a point that needs to be made somewhere on the internet at some point. So describe the differences between the nitric oxide we might find in the produced in our respiratory tract through nose breathing, for example, and how this happens, and then what's the difference on a molecular level with the nitric oxide that's going to have an impact on our vasodilation.
Yes, so there are almost every cell in the body produces nitric oxide, and there are thousands of forms of nitric oxide. So probably don't want to touch on all of them, but the two that we're really concerned with for performance are, one is eNOS. This is endothelial nitric oxide. This is created in response to shear stress on the vasculature. So as more blood flows to these large pipes and arteries, it pushes the walls of those arteries outwards. So it's stressing them. And in response to that, they release nitric oxide, and then that causes the arteries to open, allows more blood to flow. That's one form. The other form is specifically the form that is attached to the hemoglobin molecule that we had talked about earlier, and that's technically called S-nitrosylethyl. So it's when hemoglobin is what's called nitrosylated. So a nitric oxide is attached to the cysteine on hemoglobin, and that is the form that is responsible for dilating the small pipes. So eNOS is big pipes, arteries. S-nitrosylethyl is small pipes in the microvasculature. Those are the two that we're really concerned with from an exercise standpoint. When people are measuring expelled nitric oxide, completely unrelated. I have heard that claim as well, that I've heard people try and connect those dots and say, when you nose breathe, you produce more nitric oxide, more is breathed out, and that means that you have better control of blood flow to your tissues. These systems are not mixing and interloping with one another. That's just fundamentally an incorrect assumption.
Okay, but maybe what is happening. So I forget where it's from. I think it's from Thinking Fast and Slow. Is it Daniel Kahneman that wrote?
Yeah, Daniel Kahneman.
Daniel Kahneman, yeah, right. And I think I think it's a quote from his book, but or maybe it's from you. I'm not sure. You have to correct me. We're right about most things, but we're wrong about how they happen. So like the facts are what they are, or maybe the outcome is known and is understood, but the underlying factors that influence that outcome maybe are not what we think they are. So we're maybe misled on the causes. So would it be correct then to talk about the improved vasodilation and also oxygen extraction through nose breathing, or maybe just through hypoventilation linked to CO2 rather than nitric oxide?
So this is where, when people think that CO2 is obviously a vasodilator, so if you're nasal breathing, you're retaining more CO2, you are going to vasodilate. That is true, but the reality is that the effects of CO2 on blood vessel tone are actually minuscule compared to nitric oxide. So it's really not going to make that large of a difference. It just so happens that the things that reduce CO2 to a relatively large degree, those are also decreasing nitric oxide release to a very large degree. So it's not really the lack of CO2 that's causing that left shift in the dissociation curve so much as it is the lack of nitric oxide that is leading to those effects. But those things are so tangled together, and these findings with nitric oxide are so poorly understood that they just get kind of mishmashed together.
That makes sense. And going back to what we talked about before, we talked about shear stress, the enos, so the endothelial part. Is there anything else we need to be conscious about, or is there anything that we need to do or think about when it comes to optimizing for that nitric oxide molecule to some extent? Is it worth thinking about it in those terms, or are we looking for other things? You did mention it as being one of the most important molecules when we talk about vasodilation. So how do we need to conceptualize in terms of how can we affect the levels of nitric oxide that are circulating and that are going to have a positive impact on our vasodilator capacity?
Yeah, so there are going to be specific forms of training that are going to allow you to both increase your ability to produce nitric oxide and release nitric oxide. Those forms of training are going to be different from person to person. The issue is that nitric oxide in that form cannot be measured up until now, which is why we should talk about this down the line. There's some interesting things coming down the pipeline that are going to make this very practical. But right now, it's not an entirely practical concept. Most people aren't going to know if they have deficiencies in this molecule. They don't have a way of measuring it. The way that I would think about it is, I mean, I know you had Phil Skiba on recently. Phil Skiba just wrote a fantastic book on training.
It's really good. I'm halfway through. It's fantastic.
Yeah. I usually don't like training books, and this is one of the first training books I've read in years, and I'm like, man, this is just a solid training book all in all.
Yeah.
So if you read Phil's book, he talks about a lot of the things that are going to increase nitric oxide. He never mentions the word nitric oxide. It's not said once in the book, but he talks about instances where you would want to train to increase your capilarization, people that's going to be advantageous for. Other people, they don't need that. They may need to improve their critical power, and that's going to be the thing that moves the needle for them. Other people may need to prioritize their VO2 max. So I do like thinking in the terms that he's thinking in, because they're very big picture things. He's not trying to affect specific molecules in our body. He's just talking about these big picture concepts. And if you're training the way you identify as your limiter, VO2 max, your critical power, your maximal sprint speed, if you identify which of those you're dealing with and you actually do the training that you need to do to increase it, you're going to take care of a lot of these other issues that we're talking about. So despite the fact that you're not measuring it, which I think does add a lot of precision, you could get in that ballpark. You're kind of hitting the 80%. And then maybe in the future, we could talk about how to get that under 20% for the really high level performers. But I think those are really good guidelines. And I do think it is a book that anyone interested in endurance performance would definitely get a benefit from it, even if they already know a lot of these pieces of information. He just explains things in a really nice way.
Yeah, I love the frame that he brings, and just his general outlook on training, and it's quite simple to understand, despite what one might think. Obviously, when he goes into a bit more of the calculations of the slopes and the averages and the weighted averages and whatnot, it might get a little hard for some people, but it's worth struggling through it, especially if you're interested in endurance training and having a sound and comprehensive approach to the matter. Let's switch to another topic that I wanted to tackle with you, and that's the one of critical metabolic rate. I've been chatting with Andrew Feldman and Phil Batterson as well. They're working on they call it critical oxygenation. And so I believe that is in the ballpark of the critical metabolic rate that you've been talking about for some time. So for those who are not familiar with it, can you maybe describe what that term means? Let's stick with critical metabolic rate, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, so I'll just caveat, I'm not familiar with their critical oxygenation concept. I do need to catch up with both of them. So if what we're saying is contradicting, we may not be talking about the same thing. So keep that in mind. But basically, critical metabolic rate, it's a physiological corollary to critical power. So critical power is, in theory, an intensity that you could sustain indefinitely without outstripping your finite energy or supply of energy. That's a very, very watered down version of what critical power is. So the idea is if you're operating at an intensity above your critical power or your critical speed, if you're running, you're going to deplete a finite energy reserve. Once you deplete all of that finite energy reserve, you fail. If you work at an intensity below your critical power, you replenish that energy reserve. People's rates of replenishment vary, and then you get further away from failure. Critical metabolic rate is a very similar concept, but it's based on rates of oxygenation. So if you're at a metabolic steady state, your rate of change of oxygenation is going to be 0% per second. It's a slope that's flatlined. Nothing is happening. Oxygen's not going up. It's not going down. If you're at a very low intensity, your rate of oxygenation or your rate of change is positive. So it's a positive slope. Oxygen is going up. If you start exercising at a hard intensity, that slope becomes negative. And the harder and higher the intensity, the more negative it becomes, which means oxygen is going down at a faster and faster rate. Now, for pretty much everyone, that critical metabolic rate, like I said, is 0% per second. But in reality, it varies a very small amount. It might be minus 0.5% per second, positive 0.5% per second, but let's just call it 0. Now, so we have that critical metabolic rate. The thing that differentiates all of us is the amount of work we could do at an intensity greater than critical metabolic rate. And that's something that's, using Brett Kirby's terminology, is called M prime. So when you exercise at a critical metabolic rate when you exercise at a metabolic rate above your critical metabolic rate, I hate how long these words are, you deplete your M prime, and when your M prime depletes, you reach failure. So it's essentially a way of conceptualizing bioenergetics in delineating steady state from non-steady state exercise. But the thing that's very nice about it is it's not just a theoretical concept. We could actually use these critical metabolic rate models in live time to predict time to exhaustion. So if we know that Sean's critical metabolic rate is 0% per second and his M prime is, let's say, 100, just to have some very easy math, we could actually use his critical metabolic rate right now, say it's minus 2% per second, and I could back calculate and figure how close is he to failure. Well, Sean's probably about a minute away from failure right now. So let's have him back off his pace and he'll go really slow and his critical metabolic rate becomes positive. Now he's buying himself more time before he fails. And we could model these things in live time to effectively say, hey, if you need to run 10 miles as fast as possible, we could pace you in live time to make sure that you essentially get there with your gas tank completely depleted. And there's much more sophisticated things that we could do with this, but this is kind of the big picture.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like let's say a cousin concept to what Andrew and Phil are working on, from what I understand. And I did a video with Andrew on this. They're looking for a way to find your zero slope of SMO2 essentially. Mm-hmm. So I sent Andrew some of my data, and I did I think it was 3 on 1 off with incremental powers on the bike, and then he calculated my oxygenation slopes on those different powers, and then he came back to me with a value that was my my zero slope for SMO2. And what's interesting is that it makes total sense. And for those who haven't read Brett Kirby's work on this, please go read his paper. If I forget to put it in the show notes, just shoot me a comment on YouTube and I'll put you the link over there. But essentially what you see in Brett's paper and on the basic idea of the zero slope of SMO2 is that it's going to correspond closely to critical power, which would make sense. Now, what I've seen is that through all the testing that I've been doing is that there's kind of two different SMO2 profiles that emerge. If we look at the moderate, heavy, severe intensity distribution, for profile, I'll call it profile 1 because I still haven't found a way to describe those, but profile 1, I'll see an increasing slope in SMO2 in the moderate intensity domain, a flat, more of a flat slope in the heavy intensity domain, and then a negative slope in the severe intensity domain. Does that make sense so far? Then I have, and so it would make sense that your zero slope would correspond to that boundary of heavy to severe, which is our critical power. Now, there's a second profile that emerges where in the moderate intensity domain, that SMO2 slope is flat. And then it goes to a negative slope in the heavy intensity domain, and then it goes to flat again in the severe intensity domain. So after I sent my data to Andrew, he came back to me and he said, your zero slope is at around 170 watts. I think it was 160 on my left leg, 180 on my right leg. My critical power calculated with a 3 and a 12-minute test with the linear relationship is at 280. But my first threshold is right around 170. So it seems like, as me being a profile 2 from the data that I've been collecting, my zero slope is actually my first threshold. Whereas for somebody with the first profile that I described, their zero slope would be their critical power. Have you seen that as well in the testing that you've done and the data you've collected?
Yeah, so it's funny that you mentioned that because there are some people where there's literally no intensity that they're not at a negative slope. Like you could do VO2 testing on them and you could find a light intensity domain and they're still at a negative slope. So this is where I think there's clearly some missing pieces to relate these different paradigms. Like a lot of people have questioned, is critical power just a mathematical artifact or is it a real physiological boundary? I'm kind of inclined to say it is a mathematical artifact that does have importance because it does actually have predictability. But I think it's possible that when we really look into the critical power literature, there's a lot of things that aren't accounted for. So I think critical metabolic rate is a more useful concept because it does predict performance for these people where critical power does not accurately predict performance. And it also accounts for the day-to-day variability, that aside. But yeah, short answer or long answer short, basically, yes, I have seen people that are always negative, independent of if they're in the light, moderate, heavy, severe intensity domain. And there are some people that their critical metabolic rate profiles are more similar to VO2 kinetics, where it's really only when they cross the heavy to severe threshold that they go negative. That's almost unheard of in CrossFit athletes, though. You almost never see that. Most CrossFit athletes go negative in the light to moderate domain.
Would you say that has something to do with the oxygen consumption and maybe what type of fibers they're preferentially recruiting at different intensities?
Yeah, I think it could be oxygen consumption. It could be that they have poor peripheral circulation. So really independent of the intensity that they're doing, they're really never reaching a metabolic steady state. There's a lot of factors that could go into this. It could be efficiency, the fact that they're never really doing any movement enough to become efficient at it. Even top CrossFit Games competitors, they're not really that efficient on anything that you do. When you put them through VO2 testing, you can even use a rower or an assault bike and you see that they're terribly inefficient. And it makes sense given that they maybe spend 2 hours on a given modality in a week, and that's on the really high end, where we look at a moderate level runner and they might be running 15 hours a week. They're compounding so much more volume, and you blow that out to an elite runner and it's far beyond that. So I think it's part of it is just like by virtue of the sport, you're just never going to have someone be that efficient as a CrossFitter.
Going back to critical metabolic rate, I've seen some great posts from you on Instagram a while back talking about this. And like you said, predicting time to task failure or time to exhaustion. How close or how far are we from having those types of model being applicable in real time for someone who maybe doesn't have all the, the data skills and the analytic skills that you might possess?
I'm trying to think of how to properly answer this. So the technology and the understandings are already there. It is feasible right now. Just the software to do it is not publicly available, but it does exist. The caveat is that these models do fail under certain conditions. For example, if someone has any lingering injuries, these models will fail. Their legs will predict different times to exhaustion. Sometimes one of them is accurate and the other isn't. Sometimes neither of them are accurate, depending on what the specific issues are. If someone has COVID and they have severe case where they have long COVID, their models may not be accurate for 6 to 12 months after that, from what I've seen. That's due to the effects on the microvasculature, because a lot of these models are based on rates of oxygenation. COVID could impact the microvasculature, so you have seen that happen. So there are instances where just by virtue of how we do these critical metabolic rate models, there's no way to make them accurate in certain populations at certain times. So this is where I do think over time, having something that accounts for both the physical output component, speed or power, and metabolic rate together in one single model is probably going to be more accurate in more scenarios, because both critical power and critical metabolic rate, they're like Venn diagrams. There's times when critical power is better, time when critical metabolic rate's better, and then there are times where they both predict time to exhaustion roughly evenly. I've had some case studies where I've worked with athletes and they'll predict time to exhaustion within critical power will be 2.5 seconds off and critical metabolic rate will be 1.5 or 3 seconds off. That's pretty high accuracy. And then you'll have cases where critical power predicts time to exhaustion. It's like 3 minutes off and critical metabolic rate's perfect. So I think if we could figure out why that is, why is it that critical power is better sometimes, CMR is better other times, and then if you could take that context dependency, put it on, potentially use some machine learning algorithms, you can make it much more reliable and you could remove the human from this equation.
Yeah, that's definitely linking those two together. What I'm thinking about is critical power, or the expression of the power duration relationship under fatigue, stuff that they're studying now in cycling. James Sprague on the podcast last week. And this is what they do. They do power duration profile, usually with I think it's a 3 and a 12-minute test, or maybe a 5 and a 20-minute test, fresh, rested. And then they do it after, I think it's 2000 kilojoules of work. And they look at the percent decrement in that critical power from fresh to fatigued. And the fatigued, or the percent decrement, is inversely correlated to performance in races, because we know that critical power is not necessarily a great predictor of cycling performance, but your power duration profile under fatigue is actually highly predictive of performance. So that's maybe where we need to get Moxie's on those cyclists doing those tests pre and post, and then seeing if in those fresh and fatigued state we see some noticeable differences between trends, right?
And this is where I think that's probably initially based off a lot of the work that like Andy Van Hittala and Andy Jones have done at Exeter. They've done a lot of those kinds of trials in the past. We'll have someone do like a 2-hour submaximal exercise test and then establish critical powers, and they'll get how all these things are influenced. And I do think that using those kinds of tests do make critical power and critical metabolic rate more actionable, but those are highly impractical. Like in high performance athletics, you just can't really do those. Even establishing a critical power or critical metabolic rate, it's just not doable under so many circumstances. This is where I think layering in some sophisticated ways of analyzing data, you could actually capture critical power and critical metabolic rate without ever having someone test either of these measurements, just from using their training data day to day. And then you could update these models both over time. And then while you're actually having someone do a time to exhaustion trial, you can look at how both W prime, the amount of work you could do over critical power, and how M prime, the amount of work you could do over critical metabolic rate. You could see how both of those are depleting in live time. And you could also look at another measurement, something like velocity loss thresholds. So if you have like a triaxial accelerometer on someone,
Mhm.
and you could look at the velocity loss threshold, and you could see if W prime and M prime are depleting at different rates from one another. You could back calculate and you could say, hey, which of these models seems like it's more reliably matching these velocity loss thresholds? So if it's the critical metabolic rate model, jettison the critical power calculation and stick with critical metabolic rate, and that's going to predict accurately, or vice versa. Or if they're both depleting in similar rates, keeping in mind that the units are actually different for both these measurements.
Mhm.
Compared to the velocity loss threshold, then you could use both of those models, could do a combined average to predict time to exhaustion. So there's a lot of different options like that that could be done as well. And ultimately, that's just software. It's expensive to do that, but it's software.
So it's to be continued on that topic specifically. The last big topic I wanted to tackle with you today is sprint training. So if we say Wingate, for example, which is usually a 30-second all-out effort. I got your email, I think it was last week or beginning of this week, talking about a little study that you're running around sprint training, where you're looking for people to share some. Are you still looking for participants in this? Are you still looking for data?
Not anymore. I actually got contacted by some pretty big teams of people. So there's like 50 or 60 people doing the test this week, getting the data. So I'm like,
okay, awesome. So people stop sending Evan emails, and please don't after this podcast, because it will be too late. It's funny because a few weeks before you sent out the email, I started doing some Wingates myself on the bike erg and looking at SMO2 profiles. And I guess 4 big things stick out, which is your maximum SMO2 value, your minimum SMO2 value, your desaturation slope, and your deoxygenation slope and reoxygenation slope. So you have those 4 big components. And so I'd be interested in getting your perspective on each one of those in turn. So for you, what do they represent? What does SMO2 max tell us about an athlete? What does SMO2 min tell us about an athlete? Downslope, upslope, and also obviously the relationship of those parameters across time as we do maybe a test, retest on, for example, a Wingate protocol.
Yeah, so I'm going to answer those in reverse order. So
let's go.
the downslope represents the maximal rate of deoxygenation. The upslope is the maximal rate of reoxygenation. Or SMO2 max and SMO2 min become important is how they impact that. So me and you could both have the same downslope. It could be 5% per second. Yeah, we both have the same maximal rate of oxygen utilization. Well, if both of us bottom out at 10% oxygenation and you start at 80 and I start at 60, well, how much more substrate do you have to power that sprint than I do? It's a lot. Now, the issue is if we're doing a 30-second sprint, do you have enough time to utilize all of your oxygen? Because if you don't, you're leaving performance on the table. So this is where it's so context dependent. Essentially, what you want to do to maximize sprint performance is have the biggest tank, but then the ability to utilize all of that. So let me just do some quick math, because clearly that's not my specialty. Okay, so if you were utilizing at a rate of 5% per second, you would need 150% SMO2 to start to utilize at that rate. So that's probably not a good example, but the same concept is going to apply. So this is where just doing a Wingate sprint, what's the best predictor of performance? Is it max SMO2? Is it min SMO2? Is it the downslope? Is it the upslope? Is it the time percent spent at a 0 slope at the bottom when you deplete, shorter versus longer? Is it the half time to reoxygenation? I could think of probably 15 different measurements that we could get from this Wingate sprint. So essentially what we're trying to do with this study is, if you imagine dimensions in space, so 2-dimensional, or 1 dimension is a point, 2-dimensional, it's a line, 3-dimensional is a cube, 4-dimensional, you can't picture that. Each of these different measurements that we could get, say 15 from a Wingate, is a dimension. So we have a 15-dimensional space of data. You can imagine it like a vapor cloud. Essentially, what I'm trying to do is get all these different dimensions and get enough people's data and then use a technique called dimensionality reduction. So it essentially takes it and it smashes that all down to the minimum amount of dimensions that explain the maximum amount of variance.
Is that,
So
I'm sorry to cut you off. Is that,
yep.
Are you familiar with the Big Five psychological model?
Only marginally so.
Yeah, it's a statistically derived personality trait assessment, essentially, where they took, 10,000 questions and then they clumped down together different people that answer different questions in different ways. And at the end, you come out with five. That's what it's called, the Big Five. It's 5 big personality traits. Each one has 2 subcategories, but it was derived statistically. It came from just people answering it and then doing that regression or that dimension. What would you call it? Dimension reduction?
Yeah, dimension reduction. So what that would probably be using is it's something in machine learning is called a nearest neighbor algorithm. So essentially the idea is if we have this high dimensional space, if you are next to another person in that high dimensional space, you probably have a lot in common with that person. And if you are very far across those dimensions, you're probably very different from them. Now we could take all of those millions of people forming that giant point cloud and essentially say, hey, if we wanted to say there's 5 groups, what are the 5 neighborhoods within that cloud? And we will just make an assumption and say that everyone within that neighborhood is pretty much the same, barring some minor differences. Then we could say you're one of these 5 groups. Now you could take that survey and you get put into one of those 5 neighborhoods. And what that means is you are more like all the other people in that neighborhood than you are like people in those other neighborhoods, despite the fact that you still have things in common with everyone. It's a similar technique. I wasn't familiar with that specific test, but as you're explaining it, yeah, it's basically the same idea.
All right, so I'll let you continue on the dimension reduction of the different parameters that we can quantify from a Wingate test.
Yeah, so basically we have all these different dimensions, and there's a model that we could use to essentially see, if you imagine dimensions on the x-axis from 1 to 15 and variance on the y-axis from 0 to 100, we might see that 1 dimension explains 20% of the variance and 2 dimensions explains 60%. And then once you hit 3 dimensions, it's 90% of the variance. Then the other 12 dimensions like marginally account for variance between people. I don't know what it's going to turn out to, but essentially we see like an elbow shape where more dimensions doesn't mean more variance. And that's the point that we'll say that's how many groups we have, wherever that elbow is. So if we find that there are 4 dimensions that explain 90% of the variance, that's it, 4 dimensions. So now we're going to break it down and distill those dimensions into what are called components. And those 4 components are going to essentially operate as like distinct groups or avatars. And then you could understand one of those components. It might be the first component. That's the high performer. They crush a Wingate. What are the characteristics they could possess? Versus that other component group, maybe they're the people that are really bad at Wingate tests. What are their defining traits? So then you could start to parse these out. The Wingate is what we're starting with because it's so simple. You just can't mess up the test. And also these types of analysis are very computationally expensive. It's a lot of data, and I don't want to run the calculation on my laptop for 6.5 hours. So using a test that is 30 seconds is really beneficial for me. But if this works, maybe I'll get a better computer and I'll do it with other tests. I don't know. I haven't thought that far into the future of where this is going. It was more of just, will people send me data? Could I do this? And then what happens? And then I'll figure it out after that.
Well, I'm glad you have a lot of people sending you data already. So that's going to be exciting to see. You had put up a post months ago about some tracking that you did on some maximal sprints an athlete was doing with you, and the relationship with that negative slope. So how fast you can essentially, from what I understand at least, how fast you can extract and utilize oxygen was pretty highly correlated to the power output that the person was able to generate. Since then, have you been able to replicate that, or have you seen other data that point in that same direction, where it seems like, despite everything that we want to say about glycolytic power and all those anaerobic mechanisms, oxygen plays a central role, even in those very, very short and intense sprints.
Yes, that original case study, it was one individual over 36 weeks, and you could see a very strong correlation between those. I haven't replicated that, but we have done 21 people over 10 weeks. And in that study, we saw those same relationships. It was still quite strong across that whole group. So it does appear that maximal deoxygenation rate is very strongly correlated with maximal power output. Haven't looked into it too much more since that 21-person study, though, because I haven't had time to do that, but maybe something worth following up in the future.
That's fair. So from your perspective, going into that data collection process, what is your hypothesis going in? What factors do you think are going to have the biggest impact on Wingate performance?
Yeah, so I'm honestly going into it not making any assumptions, just because I would very much like to do it as an exploratory process. But the reality is I think maximal deoxygenation rate is going to be very strongly correlated with performance. That said, I don't think the highest, I think it's going to be more of a bell curve shape. The people with the highest maximal deoxygenation rate are not going to have the best performance, because they're going to probably hit a wall in about 10 seconds or so. If I'm estimating, I know for myself, if I do a maximal effort sprint, I hit 0% SMO2 between about 9 and 11 seconds typically. And then I'm pretty much screwed from there on out. And we're doing this Wingate style, so we're not instructing people to gamify it for the best 30-second score. They're ramping the bike up to a maximal wattage off the bat and then just hanging on for dear life. So this is where I think we will see that bell-shaped curve. Oddly, I think the reoxygenation slope is probably going to be very highly correlated with performance, because the physiological factors that influence the reoxygenation slope are probably also going to influence someone's ability to maintain near maximal levels of power output for longer. So there's a lot of different things that I think are going to play in here. What the real question is, though, is what is the most important? Because if we determine that maybe 2 or 3 of these 15-ish factors account for almost all of the variance in performance, well, that's really what we're trying to do in exercise physiology. I mean, if we were to say, what's the most important thing for running a mile? We could probably think of, what do you think, 30 to 50 things between us that are going to influence mile performance. And I really don't think that's an exaggeration. That's so unhelpful from a training standpoint. Like, what, do we just train all of those? So imagine doing this analysis on a mile and finding if you have 1,000 people do a mile and you reduce it down and you find that maybe 4 things explain 95% of the variance in mile performance. Those are 4 things that everyone should train. And maybe those other 35 factors that we identify, they're just not important to think about. They'll get taken care of just by virtue of tackling those 4 things. So this is potentially an area that I see this going over time. It's just simplifying training. Yeah, we could pontificate and find 1,000 things that impact performance. Maybe for CrossFit, it's even more. But could we distill that down to the bare number of things that are going to take care of the 95%? And if we could do that, then training is infinitely simpler, and we may find that time well spent on those variables and less on things that may not be as worthwhile to think about does create better performance. Maybe it doesn't make a difference. Maybe training is simpler and people don't perform any better. That's still nice, because we don't have so many head scratchers when we're trying to think of what to give people.
I was looking through the literature on Wingate's training, which is usually, or sprint interval training, I think is how it's defined in the literature, which are usually sprints, all-out sprints between 10 and 30 seconds in duration, anywhere from 3 to 7 reps per session, usually 2 to 3 per week, anywhere from 1 to 4 minutes rest between efforts. And there seemed to be some interesting results when it came to VO2 max improvements. Granted, those were pretty short time spans, 2 to 3 weeks, and obviously probably not on very highly trained populations. From your perspective, and we talked about what's going on at the muscle level, oxygen extraction. So what might be the benefits, or what might be happening, let's say, on a physiological level performing those type of all-out, fairly short efforts?
Yeah, so on that short of a time scale, I'd be inclined to say it's probably muscle fiber recruitment that are accounting for most of those changes in VO2, or if they extended that study out further, you're probably not going to see additional improvements in muscle fiber recruitment, but you'll probably start seeing greater improvements in mitochondrial biogenesis, for example. That'll probably make a difference. But I think if you extend that out maybe past 4 to 6 weeks, you're probably not going to see increases in VO2 max for many people, unless they're so untrained that doing a 10-second sprint is kind of improving every system, which at that point, like, they could have probably done the worm for those 6 weeks, and that would have also improved their VO2 max. So,
all right. So we have the fiber recruitment. So would you say that it might be an interesting training intervention for less trained people that could still tolerate those types of effort from a standpoint of expressing maximal power, or literally just reaching the ceiling of output that the person can reach? Do you see a benefit even from a health standpoint using those kind of protocols? And obviously not week in and week out, but for certain periods of time at certain periods of the year, maybe?
Yeah, it depends how untrained someone is and what their goals are. Because I mean, just risk of injury does go up as absolute intensity goes up. You also, coordination becomes something to think about. So I think I've heard Pat Davidson explained it as, you don't have a Honda Civic, try and go 120 miles per hour, is probably how he said it. Maybe a little bit less politically correct, perhaps, but I mean, it's a general idea. For someone who's very untrained, you kind of have to figure anything is probably going to get them an adaptation. So at that point, I'm really just catering to personal preferences and what they like doing. Because if everything works, might as well give them what they like, and they're more likely to do it over longer periods of time and reap the rewards. Where maximal effort sprints, albeit short, they can be pretty shitty. So if that's unpleasant for someone to do, they're probably not going to be able to do it for weeks and months on end, and they're not going to compound those adaptations. I also do consider as well just the low amount of work volume that they're doing. Energy expenditure as a whole is going to be on the lower end. So if they do care about body composition, even if they are getting the adaptation with low volumes, they're really not doing a lot of work. And that's something to consider as well. So,
man, that was quite a ride. That was a lot of fun, Evan. I appreciate you coming back on the podcast, and I feel like it had been too long, so we need to do that again sometime soon. What do you look forward to researching, investigating, learning on your end in the coming months?
Man, I am very excited to just start collecting more of this data, start analyzing the results, and see what the next fun study to do is. Not much more than that.
All right. Well, we very much look forward to hearing from you following those computations that you're going to be running on the data you collected. And obviously, I'll make sure to share any future data collection efforts that you might have. Evan, if people want to follow your work, where can they find you online at this point in time?
At this point, probably the only place I'm active online is Instagram, and name is pretty easy to find me. It's Evan Peikon. So my name, I'm the only one in the world. So that's the one place.
Fantastic. The link is in the show notes. You're still publishing on your Substack?
No, I haven't been active on there in a few months. Probably won't be anytime in the near future.
Well, for people interested in what you're talking about, I would still recommend that they go check it out. The link is also in the show notes. Some great content and information on exercise physiology. Evan, thank you so much for coming back on. It was a lot of fun, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me again, man. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you would like to support the podcast, please take a few moments to leave a written review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. If you want to watch this episode again, you can find the full video recording on my YouTube channel. You'll also find hundreds of hours of free content, all my podcasts, my thoughts of the day, structured presentations, and more. So don't wait, go subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode. Take care.